It was past midnight in the Belgian woods, December 1944. The mist had turned the forest into a ghostly maze of shadows and whispers. The men of Baker Company, 101st Infantry, crouched low in the frozen mud, their breath forming pale clouds in the dark. The wind carried the faint rattle of distant gunfire, but closer now, too close, came the scraping of boots and the muted clink of metal. Sergeant Miller raised his hand, signaling silence. Every man froze. They could hear them, German voices, low and confident, drifting through the fog. The enemy thought they had found a lost American patrol. In truth, they had walked into a trap. Miller had made a choice that went against every instinct. Instead of calling artillery or pulling back, he told his men to hold fire. Let them come. Let them think they had surrounded a handful of frightened Americans. The idea was madness to some, genius to others. But Miller knew what was behind him, 2 miles of open snow and wounded men who could not move. If the Germans broke through, no one would make it to dawn. The men waited in absolute stillness. The frost crept through their gloves and bit into their fingers. Private Owens clenched his rifle so hard his knuckles ached. He could see faint outlines moving between the trees now, dozens of them, maybe more. The Germans were spreading out, whispering orders, their boots crunching on the icy ground. They were confident. They believed the Americans were finished. A single flare arced into the air, painting the fog in pale green light. For a heartbeat, the whole forest glowed like glass. Miller could see their faces, young, tired, and certain of victory. He whispered through the radio, "Not yet." The seconds stretched. Every sound seemed too loud, the creak of leather, the drip of melted frost from a helmet rim. Then, as the flare burned out, darkness swallowed them again. The Germans kept advancing. Inside every American soldier, fear wrestled with discipline. They had trained for this moment, but training never teaches you what the cold feels like when death is 20 yards away. Miller's voice came softly, almost a breath. "Hold steady. 10 more yards." His hand trembled as he reached for his carbine. He thought of home, of his wife waiting by the window in Kansas, and he prayed she would never know this night. The Germans stopped suddenly. One of them called out in English, mocking, "You are surrounded, Yankees. Drop your weapons." No one answered. Silence hung so heavy it seemed to press the trees down. Miller's men waited, muscles locked, hearts pounding in rhythm with the distant artillery thuds echoing from Bastogne. The Germans laughed, thinking the Americans had surrendered in fear, but they were wrong. Very wrong. The first shot came not from a rifle, but from the crack of ice breaking beneath a boot. A German soldier slipped, cursed under his breath, and that sound, tiny, human, fragile, was the final signal. Sergeant Miller whispered, "Now." The forest exploded. Muzzle flashes ripped through the darkness like lightning behind smoke. The Americans rose from the mud as one body, firing in controlled bursts, each shot precise, deliberate, unhurried. They had waited until the enemy was inside 50 yards, close enough to see the white of their scarves, close enough to smell the cordite in the air. The trap had sprung shut. The Germans panicked. Some dropped to the ground, some fired blindly into the trees, and some shouted orders that vanished under the roar of rifles. Miller's men moved in silence between bursts of gunfire, shifting positions, using the fog like armor. Private Owens fired until his rifle steamed from the cold, his hands trembling but steady enough to reload by instinct. Beside him, Corporal Hayes muttered a quiet prayer with every round he sent into the dark. They were outnumbered 5-1, but inside that fog, numbers meant nothing. The Germans had no idea where the Americans were. A flare went up again, turning the snow into a green ocean. For an instant, both sides froze, faces illuminated like ghosts. Miller saw them, rows of German helmets glinting in the light. He shouted into the radio, his voice calm, "Second line, on my mark." 3 seconds later, machine guns from the ridge above opened up. The sound was deafening. Tracers sliced through the mist, tearing into the advancing troops. Trees splintered, snow erupted in white bursts, and men fell without cries. The Germans tried to regroup, but the angles of fire were impossible to predict. They were trapped in a triangle of death. Silent soldiers below, machine guns above, and nowhere to hide. Miller moved along the line, checking his men, shouting encouragement between volleys. He was hoarse, his throat raw from the smoke, but his voice steadied them. He saw Private Owens's helmet knocked off by a near miss and barked, "Keep your head down!" Owens grinned through the soot. "Still here, Sarge." That grin, in the middle of hell, reminded Miller why they fought, to survive, to keep each other breathing until morning. The Germans began to break. Some retreated, others stumbled into the Americans' crossfire. One group tried to flank left, but Lieutenant Harper and his team had already circled behind. Their grenades rolled into the snowdrifts, muffled thumps lighting the fog in dull orange flashes. The air filled with smoke and a low hum, the kind of sound that comes when hundreds of men hold their breath at once. Then the firing slowed. The forest was still again, except for the crackle of distant flames and the wind dragging smoke through the trees. Miller crouched, panting, eyes scanning the shadows. He knew it was not over. The Germans were regrouping deeper in the woods. He could hear engines starting, half-tracks moving into position. The trap had worked, but now the hunters would come again, and heavier. He clicked the radio once to signal the ridge. "Hold fire! Let them come closer." For a moment, no one spoke. The men stared at him, disbelief mixed with trust. He repeated quietly, "We will let them come." And through the drifting fog, the sound of German engines grew louder, rolling like thunder through the night. The engines rumbled closer, heavy and uneven, their growl echoing between the trees like some living creature stalking through smoke. Sergeant Miller crouched near a burned-out log, his face streaked with soot, eyes fixed on the dim glow ahead. Through the fog, faint headlights pierced the darkness, sweeping left and right. German half-tracks. He counted 3, maybe 4, moving slowly in formation. Behind them came the silhouettes of infantry, spreading out methodically. The first wave had been reckless. This one was trained, deliberate, patient. They knew Americans were here now, and they wanted payback. Miller pressed the radio to his lips, his voice barely audible. "No lights, no sound. They are testing us." He looked around. His men were exhausted, faces pale under layers of grime. Their ammunition was half gone, but their eyes still burned. He felt a strange calm settle over him, the kind that only comes after too much fear has already passed. The cold night air smelled of burnt oil and pine resin. Somewhere an owl called. The forest did not care who lived or died. The Germans stopped just short of the clearing. A single officer shouted an order in clipped tones. The infantry knelt, raising rifles. The half-tracks guns began to turn, slowly scanning the trees. Then came the flare, bright white this time, climbing high, bursting open above the canopy. The whole world became a frozen photograph. Miller's men lay exposed, crouched behind stumps, snowbanks, shattered branches. He did not move. He simply watched as the flare burned down, and when the shadows began to return, he gave the signal. Left flank now. Mortar shells dropped in tight arcs, slamming into the snow between the vehicles. The first half-track went up in flames, its crew stumbling out, burning silhouettes against the trees. Machine guns barked from the ridge again, slicing through confusion. German voices shouted orders, frantic and angry. The Americans shifted fire, falling back, reappearing from new angles. The forest became a maze of muzzle flashes and echoes. The fog glowed orange and gray. Private Owens reloaded behind a tree, whispering, "They keep coming." Miller crawled beside him, his coat torn, his hands bleeding from splinters. "Then we keep them coming until dawn." The two exchanged a look that needed no words. Around them, the fight twisted tighter. Hayes's squad was pinned near the creek, calling for cover. Miller waved 2 men forward, moving without thought, his body acting on pure instinct. Bullets snapped branches overhead. Each step was measured, patient, steady. He reached Hayes just as a grenade rolled down the slope, spinning in the snow. Without thinking, Miller kicked it into the creek. The explosion threw up a curtain of icy water, drenching them both. Hayes stared wide-eyed. Miller only nodded, breath ragged. "Stay low. They are not through yet." The next wave came fast. German troops charging through the smoke, shouting, rifles blazing. The Americans fell back toward a small ridge lined with frozen logs, every man firing until his weapon clicked empty. Miller grabbed the radio, shouting through the static, "All units, pull to secondary line." The reply came broken but clear. "Understood." Falling back. When the firing finally slowed, Miller dropped behind the ridge, chest heaving. Around him, men slumped against the snow, faces hollow. The forest glowed faintly from burning vehicles, the smoke hanging low like a living fog. He looked up at the faint stars through the haze and whispered to no one, "Hold until morning. That is all we can do." Then he heard it, faint at first, then growing louder, the creak of boots in the dark, the low murmur of voices. The Germans were regrouping again, and this time they were closer than ever. Dawn was still hours away, but the eastern sky had begun to pale, a thin gray ribbon above the treetops. The air had gone completely still, even the wind seemed afraid to move. Sergeant Miller knelt in the snow, hands trembling as he loaded his last magazine. Around him, the men of Baker Company waited in silence, faces half hidden by smoke and frost. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. They had survived the night so far, but the forest still crawled with the enemy. Somewhere beyond the burned wrecks, the Germans were preparing for their final push. The Americans had no artillery, no reinforcements, and barely enough ammunition for another hour. Yet not one man spoke of retreat. Miller scanned the tree line. The fog had thickened again, rolling low across the snow. He could hear them now, voices, metallic clicks, the faint grind of boots on ice. The Germans were moving slowly, carefully this time, spreading out to finish what they had started. Miller whispered through the radio, his voice hoarse, "Hold until my mark. Wait for the sound." He pulled a flare from his belt but did not raise it yet. His heart pounded with a slow, steady rhythm. This was no longer about victory. It was about not letting the enemy pass through, not letting them reach the wounded behind their lines. He looked down the line at his men. Owens crouched near a shattered pine, his face pale but steady. Hayes was reloading in silence, lips moving in quiet prayer. Harper's sleeve was soaked with blood, but he still smiled faintly when Miller met his eyes. "Almost morning," he whispered. Miller nodded once. "Almost." The first shots came from the right flank, short, controlled bursts. Then the left answered. Within seconds, the forest was alive again, flashing orange and white. The Germans advanced in waves, shouting orders in the dark. The Americans held firm, every shot deliberate, every movement practiced. The air filled with the metallic scent of gunfire and the sharp sting of powder. Snow kicked up in bursts around the men as bullets struck the ground. A tree beside Miller splintered, bark flying into his face. He wiped the blood from his cheek and kept firing. Then came the moment he had been waiting for. Through the fog, he saw the glint of steel helmets moving too close, no more than 20 yards away. He pulled the flare and fired it straight into the sky. The white light flared above them, and for an instant the forest was revealed in brutal clarity. Rows of German soldiers caught mid-step, eyes wide in shock. Miller shouted, "Now!" From the ridge behind them, hidden machine guns opened fire in a sweeping arc. The Germans were caught in open ground, trapped between light and death. They fell, scattered, regrouped, tried to push forward again, but the Americans did not yield. Every burst from the ridge drove them farther back. Smoke swallowed everything. The gunfire rolled like thunder for what felt like forever. When the last shots faded, only the crackle of fire remained. The forest was silent again. Miller stood slowly, his legs weak, rifle heavy in his hands. Around him, his men began to rise, blinking through the smoke, faces ghostly pale in the dawn light. The fog began to lift, revealing the battlefield, snow torn apart, trees shattered, black scars of burned steel scattered across the white ground. Miller removed his helmet and looked toward the horizon. The first thin light of morning touched the frozen fields beyond the woods. He whispered almost to himself, "We held." No one answered. They did not need to. The silence said everything. In the distance, the sound of engines returned, American engines this time. Reinforcements. The battle was over. They had let the Germans come too close, and in the dark, they had destroyed them all. The forest would remember that night long after the war had ended, long after names were forgotten. And when the snow fell again, it would cover the ground where courage once stood and silence once saved the living.